welcome to our webinar tonight titled What is and What is Not in the AUSIT Code of Ethics. Tonight with Dr. Aldous Ozelens, we are going to have a look at the AUSIT Code of Ethics and point out its most important principles as well as guides to ethical behaviour, while also looking at the areas which it sees as not part of interpreter or translator's roles. Tonight, we are very, very lucky to be with Dr. Aldous Ozelens, who is one of the co-authors of the 2012 rewriting of the AUSIT Code of Ethics. He's a well-known teacher, researcher, writer on interpreting and translation with an international reputation. So we are very lucky indeed to have him here tonight and to have a bit of a conversation with him about the AUSIT Code of Ethics. He's taught at several universities around Australia and most recently teaching at the Western Sydney University, where he was the head of languages in interpreting and translating area for several years. Dr. Aldous Ozelens, how are you? Thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi, thanks Patty for that introduction, and it's great to be here and talking about ethics. Yes.
Let's get straight into it. Aldous, you were one of the authors of the rewriting of the AUSIT Code of Ethics, like we mentioned, in 2012. I mean, we had a code. Why did it need rewriting?
Yeah, look, the original code was written in 1995. AUSIT, the Australian Institute of Interpreters and Translators, our national professional body, was founded in 1987. And a mark of any profession is that they have a code of ethics. Every profession has a code of ethics. And it took them a number of years to actually get around to agreeing on a code of ethics. They got a lot of help in it. There are some particular issues in interpreting and translating that are ticklish issues for ethics. So it came out in 1995. Now, it did get, even at the time, some comments that there were some deficiencies in it, or not so much deficiencies in principle, but some things weren't covered well enough. And three things in particular. One was that it was largely a code of ethics about interpreting. Translation really wasn't addressed very much at all. And the translators thought, well, you know, what is it? Do only interpreters have ethics or ethical dilemmas? And there's plenty of issues in ethics for translation as well. So the rewriting actually looked more at translation, and we'll have a look at how they did that in a minute. The second thing was that there wasn't enough on role, and there have always been arguments about what is the role of an interpreter. We'll pick up some of those arguments tonight. And it was felt that there just wasn't enough about what are our relations with other professionals, the context in which we work, and so on. And the third thing was that there were a few suggestions at several points in the old Code of Ethics. It sort of said, well, you've got to do this and this, but if you can't do it, you should withdraw from the assignment. If the conditions aren't right or something, you should withdraw from the assignment. And we looked at that, and that was criticised by a number of people because there were in certain circumstances, withdrawing from an assignment itself can be unethical. So we toned it down and changed the tone of some of the things. The old code was full of phrases like interpreters shall do this, etc., etc. So we've reduced some of the sort of harshness of it and tried to make it a more readable and a more useful document for the situations that you face in ethics. Now, talking about that, just we'll take you quickly through the code. Now, most of the people watching, no doubt, are familiar with this, but just to remind you of it, the first three principles are principles that we find in any code of ethics. Professional conduct, which means basically treating the people you work with honestly. Your clients, interpreters and translators have got many clients. and dealing with them in a professional way and not a deceitful way, and not a way that simply profits you, and so on. We are delivering a public good as interpreting and translating. So professional conduct. Confidentiality is part of every code of ethics, going right back to the Hippocratic Oath in medicine, the first code of ethics in ancient Greece. And competence, meaning don't take on jobs for which you are not qualified. That is for jobs that, well, in our situation where you don't have certification, if you don't have certification, particular language or a particular level, you should not take on those jobs. And also more, it's also in terms of what you feel yourself competent at. For example, some people really don't like interpreting in medicine, okay? And many translators will translate some areas of documents, but for example, they really aren't going to translate things that are highly technical, say in pharmaceuticals or something like that. So it's judging your own competence, and they're relatively uncontroversial and relatively universal in every profession. And then we get to some that are very specific. Now, impartiality relates to an interpreter dealing with, or a translator dealing fairly with what the people say or what the text says, without bias, and without, if you like, having an interest in one side or the other side. And we'll come back and talk about impartiality because it's a very important area. And it's important to note that not every profession has a principle of impartiality. For example, lawyers don't have a principle of impartiality. They will be as partial as they can be for their clients. However, judges have an ethics of impartiality. So clearly, interpreters are not like lawyers. Well, they're not really like judges either, but they have got a principle that they share with judges, this impartiality. And then the other, so that's very specific to interpreting. And the other one that's very specific to interpreting is accuracy. Accuracy is often difficult to define. We'll see what we do with how we define accuracy, and see some problems when accuracy is not followed. But accuracy is, of course, the reason why you're hired, to interpret accurately and completely, to translate accurately and completely. So that's, in a sense, why we're here. Now, number 6 was one of these new sections that I mentioned, clarity of role boundaries, looking at the things that are affecting the role and the perception of the role of interpreters and translators. Trying to work out, you know, where the role of the interpreter or translator stops, how we differentiate ourselves from other roles, and how we relate to other professions and the context in which we're working. The other one that was somewhat related to that is maintaining professional relationships. And this looks at a broader issue. For example, much of the interpreting and translating work we have is done through agencies, through translation companies and so on. So there are professional relations with them as well, and with the whole field. And interpreters and translators are in a very unusual situation. They work with virtually every other profession on earth. And how you maintain these relationships is really important. And there certainly wasn't enough in the old code about that. Number 8 and number 9, professional development and professional solidarity are, again, universal things. Every profession wants its members to do professional development and professional solidarity. That is, that you have a loyalty to the profession and a loyalty to your other practitioners. You may be in competition with them, but on certain issues you show solidarity. You help your fellow professionals. You resolve any conflicts in an orderly and ethical way, and so on. So they're the principles. But one of the things about the old code is that a lot of people had said that it just wasn't showing enough practical guidance and so on. Now, and so what we put in is 2 new sections. We got the translators in and put in a lot of translation issues in conduct issues specific to translators. So translators are fully ethical members of the profession, and it's no longer just a code of ethics for interpreters. And the conduct issues specific to interpreters actually took certain bits out of the old code, which was largely on interpreting, and they're now in this section. So we need to look at this issue as a whole, or the code of ethics as a whole. So these conduct issues give more, if you like, more specific advice on particular issues of ethics.
There actually is some of my favorite parts of the AUSIT Code of Ethics, and they do kind of pinpoint certain particular issues, and I find them very well hidden towards the end of the code, and I advise everyone to make sure that they read all the way through and find these gems in the last couple of pages of the code.
Yeah, it was an issue. You know, do you try and make each principle sort of full of examples and so on, and we would have had to repeat things and so on, and it's always a judgment. Do you make, you know, like each of the principles, like the impartiality principle, sort of big and fat, or do you make it lean and very you know, very cryptic, stating the main principles, the main issues, and then giving the detailed instructions really in the conduct issues areas. Yeah, and this is what we decided on. Yeah.
Look, the document definitely works when you see it as a whole. I was just being a little facetious within regards to that, but it's definitely worthwhile going all the way through to the end, folks. So, okay, we can now see what is in the Code of Ethics and what was there in all the new components that were added in. So, what's not in the Code of Ethics?
Okay, look, there's some of the things in the Code of Ethics that are not in the Code of Ethics we debated about for a long time, and it's part of a big international debate actually about interpreting and translating. So the 3 things that are not in the code are culture, helping, and advocacy. We do not regard the interpreter as primarily a sort of a conveyor of culture or an expert of culture or someone who gives cultural advice. We don't regard the interpreter or translator as a helper, and we don't believe that translators or interpreters should engage in advocacy. So they were the 3 areas that we had many debates about, and in the international literature you will see very different points of view, as we'll see in this webinar as well.
Looking over there's culture, helping, advocacy. Look, I can definitely see helping and advocacy not being in the code, but culture, how does one get rid of culture? I mean, we've always been saying that interpreters don't just build a language bridge, but we're also building a cultural bridge as well. Mm-hmm. We need to understand both the load culture and the English-speaking culture very well, and you know, bridge the gaps. I mean, how do we get rid of culture?
Yes, how do we get rid of culture? Well, it's a particular approach that is taken. Now, what I'd like to do is to actually look at this internationally, because some countries look at this in a different way. And I'm particularly looking at culture and advocacy. And I'll take the example of the United States of America. That now, the United States of America has got a different setup for interpreting and translating than we have. It doesn't have anything like NAATI or common, standards. They have what they call court interpreters. For legal areas, they have their own certification system. The healthcare area has its own certification system. The sign language interpreters have their own certification system. All those things that are combined with us in NAATI, under NAATI's umbrella here, are separate. And when you have a look at the United States healthcare area, there are a number of very prominent healthcare associations and certification bodies and so on. And all of them, interestingly, all of them stipulate that there are 4 roles for healthcare interpreters. And the roles they stipulate are, well, let's have a look at them. Firstly, first role is message converter. That is that healthcare interpreters convert one message to, from one language to another language, and that should not be controversial. Second role is message clarifier. That is that interpreters will often be in a situation where they have to clarify things. If you don't clarify, you're going to make mistakes. So message clarifier is a clear role that interpreters have. The third one gets interesting. They say that an interpreter is also a cultural clarifier, that many of the issues that arise in healthcare are of a cultural nature, and as in a cultural context, very often healthcare interpreters will need to clarify issues of culture, and this relates to the obviously the cultural diversity that is there in America. Now, Australia also has cultural diversity, but they particularly stress this. Now, in some other countries, they also, in places like Italy, for example, they don't call interpreters, healthcare interpreters, they call them cultural mediators. So the interpreting is seen to be a part of cultural mediation because there are such significant cultural differences. So these codes of the healthcare associations stress being a cultural clarifier. And the final one, role that they see for healthcare interpreters is patient advocates. Now, this comes in a situation where very many have identified racism and poor service to minority groups in the American context. That this can come at an individual level, like how clinicians treat patients, might treat them very poorly, might ignore them. But also at an institutional level, how, say, hospitals cope with cultures, with the needs of minority people who aren't served as well by the healthcare system as others, as the majority is. So these were seen to be important for the United States Healthcare Interpreter Associations, and they all speak with one voice on these 4 roles. Now, I'll contrast that to the Australian situation, and what I want to take is, in the Australian context, a very good publication from New South Wales Health. It's available online. You can find it easily. Standard procedures for working with healthcare interpreters. So this is advice, if you like, to the healthcare profession. This is advice to the healthcare profession about how you work with interpreters. And one section of this does deal with the provision of cultural information. So what do they say here? And excuse the length of the text, but they say interpreting requires a thorough knowledge of cultural difference, values and systems expressed through the use of language, etc., understanding of cultural context within which the health practitioner and the patient interact. Accordingly, healthcare interpreters may be asked to provide specific cultural related information that is relevant to the clinical and social needs of patients. However, and this is really important, however, the healthcare practitioner should direct all initial inquiries regarding culture and its impact on clinical care to the patient and their family. Now, what this means is that in Australia, they don't see culture as the primary business of the interpreter. Yes, the interpreter has to be well informed about cultures. Issues about culture may arise, they may be asked in specific occasions. However, it is the responsibility of every healthcare practitioner in Australia to be aware of cultural differences, to be able to handle cultural differences. And for God's sake, if you think there's a cultural issue, ask the patient, ask the family. Don't think of the interpreter as being the cultural issue. Some cultural issues may not be cultural issues. They're just issues related to a particular patient or a particular family or whatever. And indeed, the New South Wales Health, actually in this publication, it defers to the AUSIT Code of Ethics and says the AUSIT Code of Ethics is the code of ethics that healthcare interpreters want to need to follow. So yes, we have got rid of culture in a way. It's still there, but the important thing is that the Australian health system regards cultural differences as something of importance to all health practitioners. Issues of cultural differences are now taught in all health education, whether you're a physiotherapist or a psychiatrist or whatever you are. You actually study issues related to culture, and you have to be able to cope with culture. And that's how Australian institutions regard culture, and we would fully support that approach. Yes, there could be instances where an interpreter is asked for cultural information, but they should, in this context, be relatively rare.
Look, now that you mention all of this, it definitely makes a lot of sense, and I do support the Australian approach as well. I mean, looking at the American approach, there's so much responsibility being put on the interpreter, so much responsibility. You know, the responsibility of institutions, of professionals, as well as the patients, being put onto one interpreter, all in the same while trying to do a job that requires a lot of high cognition skills at all times. And I really like the Australian approach where the onus is put on the healthcare professional, which means that the interpreter can then focus more on the interpreting side of things. But I guess what I really focused on here, the word information, provide cultural information as opposed to providing cultural advice or cultural guidance. As interpreters, yes, you did say sometimes we are asked for information, and I think that's what we can provide. And you know, not if someone says, what should I do, then we don't tell them what to do. But if someone asks for information about a particular culture, we might give information about that culture to the best of our abilities. But I think that word there, cultural information, giving cultural information, is, in my opinion, key, as opposed to, you know, potentially getting that mixed up with cultural advice or guidance.
Yeah, and that word is deliberately there. Look, the problem with cultural advice, of course, is that it ends up in stereotypes. You know, it ends up in stereotypes about, you know, this culture doesn't do this, or this culture believes that, and in fact, you find diversity in every culture. And so, you know, it really is the responsibility of the health practitioners as the frontline workers, if you like, on cultural differences, and not see the interpreter as sort of some oracle about cultural advice. Yeah.
And you know, these days we look at countries. Within one country, there might be so many different cultures, and then you've got languages that are spoken in multiple countries, like Spanish or Arabic, and then to be asking for advice of an Arabic interpreter, that means that they have to be experts in 20 plus country cultures, plus then subcultures within those countries, and the different religions and the different backgrounds. You know, it's almost impossible, isn't it?
Yeah. So look, let's move on, and then okay. So we've dealt with the cultural issue. Maybe we can have a look at then some of the issues that there are in the Code of Ethics.
All right, yeah. Let's have a look at what is in the code a little bit more slowly.
Okay, good. Look, the first three I've already mentioned, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on them. Professional conduct, these three universal things that are in universal principles that are in every Code of Ethics. Treating everyone you come into contact professionally in a professional and honest manner. Confidentiality, retaining confidentiality. And then knowing competence and the limits of confidence and of confidentiality of competence. Sorry, they're sort of guides that I think probably we don't find a huge amount of difference. Every so often somebody breaches confidentiality because they. What was the case? Oh yeah, somebody finds that they're interpreting for somebody who owes them money, and then chases after them because they owe them money, and so on. Look, occasionally you do get those things, but they're very rare in the Australian context. Yeah, so these three are universal, and I think they're part of every profession.
Well, we've had a look at those three principles, and yes, we've got professional conduct, confidentiality, competence. We've already been through that, and we've said that they exist in every single Code of Ethics out there. What about?
Yeah, there's one other thing that I want to then include, and before we move on, and that is the importance of professional judgment. Now, the code the Code of Ethics stresses the importance of professional judgment, and we'll see this coming up again in some of the other principles. And it is a reminder that even though our Code of Ethics, it's quite detailed in some places, it's not a set of rules that you just follow blindly. It's not a set of rules to follow like the rules for stripping a machine gun. It's not like that. You are dealing with humans, and importantly, all the other professions that you deal with, whether it's health, whether it's social security, whether it's police, whether it's whatever, they also have ethical dilemmas, ethical issues to which they have to apply professional judgment. So these three principles are universal, but also universal is this notion of professional judgment, and we'll see how that's used in other principles of the code.
And you mentioned that the language was changed from the previous code. That it was very much, interpreters shall do this and should not do that. And I guess by removing that language, it does make way for the interpreter to exercise that professional judgment when they are faced with an ethical dilemma.
Yeah, and the judgments are something, and this is why they are dilemmas. There are genuine dilemmas in interpreting and in translation, and people can sometimes decide on different courses of action, but it's very important to understand what the consequences of different decisions are. So yeah, this is a reminder. There isn't a single principle that is called professional judgment, but it's actually weaved through many other principles. And maybe we can have a look at now the principles that are more specifically related to interpreting and translating. And of course, a big one is impartiality. And that comes in as the principles described here: interpreters and translators observe impartiality in all professional contexts. Interpreters remain unbiased throughout the communication exchange between the participants. Translators don't show bias towards either the author of the source text or the intended readers of their translation. And there are some issues that come along with this, and some of the points under this principle of impartiality, which is very important for interpreters and translators. Interpreters are not responsible for what clients say or write. Often you'll get into situations where people say something completely that you think is either completely wrong or false or whatever. You're not responsible for that. You're responsible for conveying it to the other party. And related to that, of course, interpreters and translators do not voice or write an opinion, solicited or unsolicited, on any matter or person during an assignment. So you're not there to comment on the parties. You're not there to comment on the text unless there's particular issues that need addressing. If you're if you're translating scientific material, it is scientific material. If you're translating propaganda, you're translating propaganda, and you translate it as honestly as you can. So this issue of impartiality is really one of the ones that starts now to differentiate the interpreting and translation profession. And as I mentioned, it's not every profession has this, but professions like interpreting and translation and judges do have this as a very strong principle. And given that we're a relatively new profession, and it largely developed, one part of it largely developed out of international relations, international war crime trials. This was very important. If somebody is accusing you of being a criminal, war criminal, and wants to hang you, and the accused is trying not to get hanged, and the interpreter's in the middle of them, you have to be as impartial as possible to both sides. And that's a principle that's carried through into the community interpreting area, into all areas of interpreting indeed. Yeah. And the other principle of that's very specific to interpreting is, of course, accuracy. And accuracy is annoyingly difficult to define. And so the principle says interpreters and translators use their best professional judgment in remaining faithful at all times to the meaning of texts and messages. Accurate is defined as optimal and complete rendering of messages or texts without distortion or omission, and preserving the content and intent of the source message or text. And this becomes very important. One of the problems, certainly one of the ethical problems that there is, that we'll have a look at in a minute, is complete interpreting, because I think it's one of the failings that we can observe, that sometimes interpreting is not complete. People might think that something said by one of the parties is irrelevant, so it doesn't need to be communicated. You have to get a complete message across, and optimal in terms of the accuracy of the message.
Let me ask you all this. When we say with content and intent, look, I understand what content is there, what is being said. Can you give a little example or elaborate on the intent part of it? I mean, what does this intent really mean?
Yeah, intent comes up in various ways. Somebody says that, let's say, a police interpreting situation, and somebody is saying that they were on Saturday night. They were home in bed at midnight, and earlier in that place or in that interview or a previous interview, they gave some different account of themselves. Well, sorry, their intent here is to say that they were in bed at midnight. That's the message that you give. That's the intent there. Another example, well, also a legal example, barristers have got all sorts of legal tricks and might ask a question like, so you didn't see the knife, did you? And that question with that tag, did you, is a very forceful question. The intent of that question is really to tear the witness apart, to doubt their previous evidence, and the witness then is put in a position of having to deny something, of having to say that something is not the case. Now that intent, that intent needs to come across in the interpreting. That this is a forceful question that is really putting the grill on the witness. Yeah.
You're really the intent, like you said, of the lawyer or the barrister there is to grill that witness, to make them feel uncomfortable. So the interpreter, when switching from interpreting for the witness or the accused to then going and interpreting for the barrister, I always say we've got to be also have the skills of being a little bit of multi-personality disorder skill as well. You've got to switch from, you know, being a barrister and trying to break someone down and you know, really put them under pressure, and then the other person may be breaking down under the pressure, and you know, they might be very nervous, they might be angry, they might be breaking down even. So that also has to come across, doesn't it? The tone of the speakers also need to be carried across, right? Does that we mean when we say content and intent, we also mean the tone of the speakers too, correct?
Yes, the tone of the speaker, the tone of the barrister. Now, the barrister could say it very quietly. So you didn't see the knife, did you? And that can have immense force. So the tone needs to come across. Yes, you can have angry tones, you can have understated tones, but there's always an intent behind those kind of tricks. Yes. The famous one, of course, I put it to you, which is actually not an easy one to translate in some language. I put it to you that you did not see the knife. You know, it's again a sort of a trick that barristers play to put pressure on, and if the interpreter is not able to convey that degree of pressure, that menace in the question, then you're not conveying the intent. Yeah.
Yes, one of my mentors and teachers, Dr. Erica Gonzalez, always said that language is power, and in court, interpreters do hold this power. If you have a barrister there that might be getting paid thousands of dollars an hour, trained for decades to make people feel uncomfortable and put them in all kinds of difficult situations, and then with the interpreter not interpreting with content and intent, you know, all that decades of training and all the money spent might just kind of disappear within those few seconds, right?
Yes. Yeah, it just becomes a question. So did you see the knife? Which has a totally different meaning, totally different intent, totally different force and so on, and poor interpreting there, yeah, can really let you down. So look, intent is important. And I'd like to look at one other thing, which is this thing that I said about complete interpreting. And because I think this is a problem in some areas. And look, we haven't really done you know, there aren't accurate studies done of what are the main ethical failings of interpreters or translators. For those of you who are listening to this and are translators, we will get to some translation issues soon, I assure you. But I want to present one example of incomplete interpreting. This was an example that was brought back to a university by a student who was out on practicum, on a field placement in a healthcare setting. So it's healthcare again. They brought this back with, well, they were very surprised by how the interpreter acted here, and brought it back. So let's have a look at this example that the student picked up and was astute enough to pick up. So we have a medical consultation, and the doctor wants the patient to have more tests again, and ends the consultation. But the patient's not happy and says, okay, I'll follow the suggestion, but what a short interview time. Why such a short interview? Charge me $200. Okay. Now, I don't think that is a passage that presents any undue translation problems. I think all the things there are fine. So Fatih, what do you think the interpreter said next?
Not sure. I would assume that he or she would have interpreted everything the way the patient said it.
Oh, you're wonderful, Fatih. But what the student observed was this. What the interpreter said was, okay, thank you, doctor. I'll follow what you said.
Oh, wow.
So why, Fatih?
Why would someone not interpret half of what was there?
I know. Look, there are many suggestions that interpreters make about things being irrelevant or so on. But I'd actually like to take this example seriously and think about what are the consequences of the interpreter not interpreting that last piece about the obvious complaint about the $200 charge. This is clearly in some private health situation, but that's there. The patient's not happy. Now, the interpreter doesn't convey that. So what is a patient to think? And the patient can think many things, but the interpreter has never thought about this. The patient might think, for example, oh, I asked the doctor, and the doctor just ended and walked out. You know, they don't care about me. Oh, bugger them. I'll go and find another doctor. Now, that's one thing that perfectly legitimately the patient might think, might react to this situation.
That's right. So,
sorry.
The patient is asking a question, saying,
yes,
why is this interview so short and you've charged me $200? And the doctor says, okay, thank you, and walks away.
The doctor apparently didn't say anything. The doctor was already on their way out of the door. And the interpreter says, okay, thank you, doctor, I'll follow what you say. Yeah. Now, so the patient might be really pissed off with the doctor. But there could be another alternative. The patient might think, oh, nobody ever listens to me. What the hell will I do? Oh, I know I'm going to be charged another $200. Look, I might skip the next time. Or the patient might think, oh, look, yeah, okay, I asked the question, but nobody asked me. Oh, bugger it. Okay, look, I suppose I'll be charged $200 again next time. Now, any of those responses from the patient are perfectly legitimate. We don't know what the patient would do. But I suspect the patient would do one of those three things, but there may be other things that the patient does. So leaving it out has consequences for the patient. But what's important here is that it also has consequences for the doctor. The doctor never heard that the patient was unhappy. So the doctor had no way to respond. And so if, for example, the patient decides to go to another doctor, this doctor is left wondering why on earth that patient doesn't turn up again. What's happened? Has he done something wrong? What's the situation? He doesn't know. Now, if the interpreter has, maybe the doctor doesn't care, maybe, but we don't know. The interpreter does not know, can't read the mind of the doctor. Now,
Well,
if the, yeah, sorry.
Maybe the doctor does care a lot, and the doctor was going to maybe explain everything, why it costs this much and why it's very much important for them to get the test done again, but just wasn't given that opportunity.
Exactly. Another option is that the well, there's more than one option. If that passage was interpreted, then at least two things might follow. One is that the doctor and the patient have a good argument. The doctor stands on why they charge so much and all the rest of it. And if two people want to have an argument, the interpreter is there to help them have an argument. That's one outcome, and that's a good outcome. Or the doctor, in fact, as you suggest, may then, if they hear that complaint about the $200, may actually think, oh, look, I haven't explained things to the patient, and maybe they want to explain things not just about the $200, but actually, that reminds the patient, look, the doctor that, look, yes, it was a short consultation. Look, I'll go over and I'll explain to the patient why these tests are important, why your medical situation is a very critical one, why we need to do this, and so on. And then you end up having a good relationship between the doctor and the patient. Now, whether they want to have an argument or whether they want to have a good relationship is up to those parties. But if you don't interpret, those parties don't get a chance to do that. And so I think sometimes this is regarded as kind of a joke or understood or well, you didn't want to bother the doctor or it sounded impolite or something like that. But in fact, there are always consequences if you don't interpret something. In the literature, this is sometimes described as symbolic violence. It's not violence in a physical way, but it's violence in that you've stopped the parties from expressing their interest. The patient has their interest, the doctor has their interest, and you've actually stopped any communication about that. So omitting things, not giving complete interpreting, always has consequences.
Now, we sometimes think that interpreters might be embarrassed to say something like this, or might be embarrassed for the patient to say something like this. We said there are consequences for the patient, there are consequences for the doctor, or is there a consequence for the interpreter?
One other option, and there are many options, and you can see, this is very interesting to think of the consequences. One other option that I didn't mention is that either the patient or the doctor twigs that not everything was interpreted, the consultation is over, but something happened that wasn't right. They can tell that it was a longer passage that the patient said and a shorter passage that was interpreted. You can see that in any language, and one of them complains about the interpreter. It could happen. Now, it's in our systems, it's fairly difficult for a patient to complain, but hey, more and more patients are complaining about more and more things, you know, and why shouldn't they? Or the doctor twigs that something went wrong and they complain. So there can be consequences for an interpreter. We don't know what the outcome would be or was. We can see these possible consequences, but all of them arise, out of that factor that the interpreter was not willing to interpret. Was the interpreter embarrassed or what? Look, there are a number of issues in the Code of Ethics that actually deal with this issue of completeness. And in that section, conduct issues specific to interpreters, it reiterates that interpreters relay accurately and completely everything that's communicated. Interpreters interpret in the first person, because if you interpret in the third person, you're usually summarizing rather than interpreting completely. And the other one that already we've alluded to before in the police example, if obvious untruths are uttered, interpreters convey accurately in the same manner as presented. So this is the role of the interpreter. You're not there to be. No interpreter can be embarrassed by anything that anybody says. If you're going to be embarrassed by anything that parties say, you know, you must not be an interpreter.
Well,
you can't use that.
Sorry, it goes back to impartiality, where you said that you are not responsible for what people say or write. You know, so that's why we shouldn't be getting embarrassed for what people say, because we're not saying that. It's the person saying it. You know, again, one of my favorite ones, I know you don't have it written on there, but one of my favorite ones in the conduct issues specific to interpreters is section 4. Interpreters maintain the emotions of the speakers in their interpreting and do not soften or enhance the force of messages conveyed, especially in special contexts such as court or psychometric assessments. Incoherence, hesitations, and unclear statements are maintained. You know, so I think that's a pretty big one too.
Yeah. Look, that is a good point. I'd love to reproduce every point and talk about them at length, but yes, that is good. And for example, in that intent question you asked, and about the barrister, the intent of the barrister, is very clear. So that is what you need to convey. Also in areas like mental health, you need to convey not only what the patient is saying or the psychiatrist is saying, but the way they say it, because often that has very important diagnostic implications. And there's many other areas in which you need to, you know, if you're in a speech pathology situation, you will reproduce the stuttering if the particular client is stuttering. You wouldn't reproduce stuttering if you were in a social security situation, because that's not relevant to the situation. It's a extraneous thing. But there are certain circumstances in which that becomes utterly crucial for you to be able to convey that. So these things about completeness and so on really have got teeth in the Code of Ethics, and I think they're very important to understand.
Thank you, Aldous. I've got a question from one of our attendees. If the client says something negative about the professional to the interpreter privately, is the interpreter obliged to interpret what has been said?
Well, what do you mean privately? You mean during an interpret? If they say something in the waiting room, they can say what they like. If it's during an interpreting situation, there is no privacy in an interpreting situation.
That's
you
right.
say if it's oh, not a bloody Chinese doctor again, not another Indian physiotherapist, you know, but this does come up. Well, the only way you'll cure it is to convey it and let the other party respond
and deal with it. It is their right. That's right. So just to clarify that, I mean, if this is said in privately in the waiting room, that everything that is said there is confidential as well anyway. But if it's said in the room, but maybe it's whispered into the interpreter's ear, that has to be.
Yeah, look, it's one of these issues that sort of brought up as, you know, this is going to be a terrifying issue for the interpreter. It doesn't happen that often. You know, people are actually grateful to get help, but, you know, because, yeah, we occasionally do get racist comments.
I always.
We do get, or we get, you know, comments about females. Oh, she's lovely. Well, convey that, you know, because it's part of the social norms. It's of the society. You know, if you say a thing like that, there should be a response.
One of the things I learned in school and that I still use every day in my interpreting jobs is the introduction. You know, I always say everything that is said will be interpreted. If you don't want something interpreted, please don't say it. Because that usually stops people from making such comments. Or if they do make the comments and then you interpret, they get a little less angry because you can say, I told you so. I would interpret everything. But when I don't make that caution and then I interpret what they say maybe directly to me, they're commenting to me, to the interpreter, making a comment about the doctor or the lawyer or, you know, or the female person in the room. And then I interpret that, they might get really angry and say, hey, I was telling that to you, not someone else, because not everyone knows the role of the interpreter, how to work with an interpreter. You might have people who are in the system for many, many years and, you know, have learned what to expect from an interpreter, but then you might have someone that doesn't use interpreter services much and they really don't understand how it works.
Yeah, I know. And the best way of handling that is to get the other party to do the running. Now, the other party might just smile and laugh or whatever, or they might get angry themselves, and they're justified to get angry.
Again, another question along the same lines. We'll move on after this one. If the client says something and says, please don't interpret this, what should the interpreter do?
Yeah, you go blah, 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 please don't interpret this.
Yes, just say everything that is said the way it is said.
Yeah, it's sort of like it's you can't mollycoddle people. Look, people are responsible for what they say. Now, it could be that I've been raised in a particular way that I think that's important, and that you should always be responsible for what you say. Maybe some people don't want to be responsible for what they say, but the only way the society can work, and that in fact, you know, people can have good relationships with the professionals who are often trying to help them. I mean, sometimes they're not trying to help them, sometimes they're trying to put them in jail, but in many cases they're trying to help these people, you know, and you can only do that on the basis of trust and the basis of good intentions, you know, and so look, obviously racism is there in the society. Obviously there are frictions in society that you need to you know, I referred to America, where obviously majority-minority situations are often very tense. You know, we've all seen that, but it is people's responsibility. You know, people are responsible for what they say. The interpreter is not responsible for what they say. So the best way to get it away from the interpreter is to give the problem to the other party.
That's right. And like you said earlier, there are consequences. We need to think about the potential things that we do or don't do And then we need to think about the potential consequences and outcomes for everyone involved, for the non-English speaker, for the English speaker, for the interpreter. Yeah, you know, it's not as easy as black and white. Whatever ethical decision you make, you need to consider the consequences and then live with it, I guess.
Yeah, and use your professional judgment to think about consequences if you don't say things or whatever. You know, there will be consequences for that. If the person makes a racist or a sexist comment and it's not conveyed, they'll do it next time. You know, and that's the consequences that are there. Yeah.
That's right. I think it's very easy for us to say here, don't do this, don't do that, but it's exactly what the Code of Ethics, the rewriting, I guess, is trying to do, is put that onus on the interpreter and say, use your professional judgment, and think about the consequences, because we can't be there, you can't be there whenever people want to make an ethical decision and then quickly say, oh, Dr. Aldous, this is what's happening. What should I do?
Yes.
Unfortunately, it's not going to happen.
Right, yeah. Okay.
All right, we'll move on. I've got some more questions, but I'll keep them towards the end if we have some time.
Okay. We'll go on to the next one, which is clarity of role boundaries, and this is one of the new areas. I mean, there were things in role and in the old Code of Ethics, but they're made much more explicit in this. And interpreters and translators maintain clear boundaries between their task as facilitators, communication, the message transfer, and any task that might be undertaken by other parties involved in the assignment. And this is where this issue of clearly defining your role occurs. So, and the explanation, interpreter and translator do not, in of course, the interpreting and translating duties assume other roles such as offering advocacy, guidance, or advice. So this is where we try and get rid of advocacy as a role for the interpreter, advice, and so on. And look, I think that was a good point that you made about, cultural information or whatever. But advice, you can be asked for advice. You can be asked for advice by any party. Sometimes it can be legitimate advice, but not advocacy. Look, I remember one point, which is sort of like it's culture and advice all rolled up in one. I think it was an immigration tribunal. They were arguing about, they were talking about a sum of money that the person had in another country, and the member of the tribunal asked, well, what's that in Australian dollars? And the poor old sort of applicant was really struggling because they really didn't know what the rate of exchange was, and the interpreter did know, and the interpreter actually gave that advice, and that was perfectly legitimate in that context. It actually helped both parties. It wasn't giving a stereotype or advocating for the person or anything like that. It was just advice. You might call it cultural information. What is the exchange rate? I think that's a good example of cultural information. But that's the level that interpreters may sometimes help. But then if the interpreter didn't know the exchange rate, they didn't know it either. So, but the issue is that you can't advocate. And look, this has come up in the international literature too. There have been sort of important authors who've argued, for example, that because interpreters often work in situations where they work between the powerful and the powerless, interpreters should always favour the powerless. For example, in an asylum claim situation and a interview with an asylum seeker, they may present their story in a fairly incoherent way, or miss out things, or not come across very convincingly or whatever. And some authors argue that an interpreter should actually improve their story to make it presentable, better presentable to the immigration official, because you're helping the powerless. Now, that's a particular social activist role, and if you want to be a social activist, I think you need to find a different profession for rather than expecting the interpreter to do it. It's perfectly legitimate to say I want to support asylum seekers. That's fine, but then you don't do it as an interpreter. And the code, is, I think, fairly clear on this, that that's not what we see that the interpreter should be doing. So it's a fairly strict view of that kind of request for advice, guidance, advocacy, whatever. And a couple of examples, or unless you've got a question.
Sorry, Aldous, I know you can't see me and you can only see the slides, so I do apologize for butting in. Now, I've got a question about this, and I think it's a pretty good question. What about business interpreters? When they're employed by one party, are they able to offer advocacy in some circumstances?
Yeah. Look, the code, it was one of the issues that I actually happen to teach business interpreting, among other things I teach. And it is an issue in business interpreting, because in business interpreting, you're hired by one of the parties. In business interpreting, there's no statutory right to use an interpreter. Like if you go to Social Security, Social Security has to provide you with an interpreter. But business people can hire interpreters or cannot hire interpreters, whatever. So if one party hires you, you become very much part of that team. And things will come up in business meetings which are a little different. For example, it's very common for during a business meeting between, say, two delegations to all of a sudden say, sorry, we need to talk about this among ourselves. Interpreter, could you please not convey it to the other party? And that's perfectly legitimate, because in that context, it is a situation in business where people do go and take time out, they talk among themselves, and the interpreter should respect that, should respect the confidentiality of what they say and not interpret. Other pressures come up in business interpreting. Look, business people are always short of time, and they're always saying, "Oh, can you summarize what the last three speakers said," and so on. So interpreters have to deal with that in some way. There are some different issues in business interpreting, but they all arise out of the logic of those business negotiations. It's a very different area of interpreting from, say, interpreting at Social Security. So look, there's a lot more we can say about business interpreting, but there's some examples of how in business interpreting you might get some other issues arising.
Thank you very much.
I'll go on and just give a couple of examples of what's given in the clarity of role boundaries, and this comes up. One of the issues that comes up is competing demands, and this also relates to this issue of what you're told by a party and what you do with it. This is a bit vague, or it sounds a bit vague, but I'll give you the context. The various participants may place competing expectations upon interpreters. The expectations may contravene the interpreting ethics. Therefore, the onus is on the interpreter to clarify the boundaries of their role and assist the clients understand how to achieve the best outcomes in an interpreted situation. And this was written in response to the many questions about what I call the terror of the waiting room. And the terror of the waiting room is related to the questions that were already raised. But in the waiting room, in the hospital waiting room, almost always, the patient tells you something, and what do you do with it? And look, interpreters have got various ways of sort of handling this. And for example, somebody might say, look, I'll tell you, all my medical history. We've got plenty of time. And then when we go in, you tell the doctor what I told you, and the interpreter's got to say, no, sorry, I don't. Now this came up also. We had an input from TIS, Translation Interpreting Service, that actually was very concerned. I've published on this, so it's public knowledge. They were concerned that often the interpreter and the non-English speaker are on the telephone together, and before it's connected to whichever person it's going to, whether it's the Electricity Commission or the lawyer or whoever it is that's the professional body that is there and is always coming late. And during that time, the interpreter and the non-English speaker have long conversations. And they said, look, we've got to get somebody to stop that, and this is TIS talking. And we had a look at this and said, look, sorry, if you believe in impartiality, there's no reason not to talk to the non-English speaker. Given that you've probably not got much of a briefing, they can give you a good briefing. For example, if you are hanging on with the authority, the person at the electricity company before the non-English speaker joined, you would ask them for a briefing. You would ask them for what's going on. You would ask them for what we're going to discuss. And there's no reason why you shouldn't do exactly the same if you're hanging there with the non-English speaker and so on. So again, it's impartiality, but it's sort of saying that whatever you gather there doesn't change your role. And if people mistake your role, as in the terror of the waiting room, and expect you to be their advocate or something, well, then you've got to remind them about this boundary. And there's one other one that I think is important, and that is, again, it's in the interpreting section. In specific institutional settings where duty of care or security rules regulate the behaviour of all participants, such as healthcare or high security settings, interpreters follow the relevant policies and procedures. That institution's relevant policies and procedures, combining them with the interpreting code of ethics. Now, this comes up again in healthcare specifically. In, say, a hospital, there are some interpreters who are employees of the hospital and some who are freelancers. The ones who are employees of the hospital do, in their contract, in their statement of duties, have this thing of the duty of care, so that if, for example, a patient says something to them that concerns the interpreter or raises concerns that the interpreter has about the welfare of that patient, about the wellness of that patient, that needs to be conveyed to a relevant authority, whether you're interpreting or not, or whatever the situation is. Now, again, it's very rare. Look, it can happen that a patient sometimes will reveal things to an interpreter that they don't reveal to others, or so on. It can happen. It doesn't happen very often. But clearly there are situations where then that needs to be taken seriously by the interpreter. And there's a higher principle here, and higher than any of the principles in the code. And it's a principle that's been established in ethical theory, in philosophy, for millennia. and that is that the primary duty of any professional is do no harm. Do no harm. This was a principle that was in the Hippocratic Oath in medicine that I've already referred to. This issue of do no harm. If you see a situation where harm is done, then you need to tell someone. Also, there can be high security settings where you're forbidden from doing certain things or from saying certain things or whatever, and you need to follow those guidelines. So there are these very, very specific institutional settings that place other demands on interpreters.
I mean, you're right. When we work as an interpreter, we are working in courts, in hospitals, in schools. Yes, we've got our own code of ethics as well, but then you've got the institutional demands of everywhere that we go and work at as well. So when we're working in the courts, we kind of have to work like that. We are a courtroom staff member. When we're at a hospital, we need to fit into the institutional demands of the hospital. When we're working in a school, we need to fit into the institutional demands of the school. I know that it can be quite demanding and tiring, but it's just the way that our profession is built, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. You're across the board. I mean, some people can specialize, or some people can avoid certain areas, but a lot of interpreters do interpret across the board, and translators translate all sorts of material. And yes, there are different sort of areas, and this relates also back to competence, knowing what you're doing. You know, in a psychiatric situation, you are doing something different from a social security situation, so you have to be aware of the context there. I'd like to go on. Look, we've been ignoring the translators again. Oh dear, this is terrible.
I know.
But look,
you said the new code did a lot for translators. Okay.
Okay.
It was
Look,
specifically
on the next slide. It's okay. We'll save the evening. We'll say the translators have got professional issues and ethical issues as well. I'm sorry to keep
translators saying we want our money's worth. All this.
Okay, so maintaining professional relationships, and this comes up because quite often you are dealing with translation companies, interpreting agencies, and so on. And the principle says interpreters and translators are responsible for the quality of their work. They always endeavour to secure satisfactory working conditions for the performance of their duties, including physical facilities, appropriate briefing, a clear commission, and clear conduct protocols where needed in specific institutional settings. And I'll just give a couple of the examples here that are in the conduct issues specific to translators. And the first one is an issue that every translator will come across, that the source text may not be perfect. And I think every translator will realize this. Now, the Code of Ethics puts it in this way: if the source text contains elements that need to be taken into account in carrying out the translation, translations use their best endeavours and apply professional judgment to bring this to the attention of the client. Such elements may include ambiguities, factual inaccuracies, linguistic error, imprecise terminology, language that in the judgment of the interpreter or translator or of the interpreter is discriminatory, or wording or references that would jeopardize achieving the purposes of the text in the target language culture. And this comes up because, of course, most of the things that you translate, particularly in community settings, were never intended to be translated. They may be horrible bureaucratic language which you know that nobody in the target audience is going to understand. You might be able to convey it in the same bureaucratic language, but is it going to be understood? But there's often factual inaccuracy, or very often ambiguities. Look, bureaucratic terminology is becoming more euphemistic, ambiguous, abstract, Many people really, I was looking at a translation just today where the bureaucrats, I think, had no idea of who might be reading this particular thing. So, and it's always important when you get a commission as a translator to look at the source text. If you just say, yeah, I'll do it, and then you find that there's a real doozy in the middle of the source text, it might be too late, and the deadline's hanging over you. So it's really important to bring this to the attention of the translation company that's given you it, or the direct client if you have got a direct client. And it is really important to understand this. Now, there again, language that may be discriminatory. Well, you need to get back. Look, if the person really wants to use discriminatory language, then and that would be a private client. Then that is what they want. But you should always check that. You should always look if you can see factual inaccuracies, which you know are inaccuracies. They need to be brought to attention of the original author. Now, very often, I can remember that working for one of the translation companies, I was sometimes asked to give a judgment on source texts that had been given them for quotation, and I would find things in the source text that I thought were very problematic. And I can remember cases where we then sent the quote along with comments on what were the problems in the source text. And I remember a really nice occasion when the commissioner sort of wrote back and gave us the translation job to do. It was a big job. And they said, hey, you guys were the only ones who commented on the text. All of the others just put in a quote for so much and didn't even look at the text, you know. And so this is really, really.
They just counted the words, probably.
They counted the words, and that was it. And as you know, not every word is worth the same amount. So look, problems in source text will dog every translator. And you need to be on the front foot and bring up those issues as quickly as possible. It's also a way of finding out what is a good translation company and a poor translation company. If it's a good translation company, they will go back to the author and ask for clarification. If it's a poor translation company, they'll say, look, the client's really sort of on the back of our necks and it's due tomorrow. Can you just translate? And then you know that you've got a very bad translation company and you should act accordingly. So these are serious things about the relationship between translators and translation companies. And one more here that is important, and this relates to another passion of mine. I'm very interested in translation revision. I was just doing a job on translation revision yesterday, and this says if translation is subject to revision or checking by another translator, the revision is returned to the original translator for approval or finalization. If changes are made to the translated text after delivery to the client without the translator's agreement and knowledge, the translator is no longer responsible for the translated text. Again, it doesn't happen often. Normally, translators and their revisers have a good relationship. A good reviser changes what needs to be changed and not just what they prefer in terms of a better word or something. But most translators and their revisers work well together. But occasionally you get a situation where the translation goes off, and then it's been finalized by the translator after revision, and it's been delivered to the client. And then when the translator sees it, it might be on a website or a brochure or something like that, they see that something's changed. And what has happened when you make inquiries about this, of course, is that the commissioner showed it to somebody in their office who spoke that language, and they didn't like a particular word or a particular phrase, and so they changed it. And yeah, so these things do happen. They don't happen often, but they do happen, and they're very annoying. But you've got to understand that the translator, you know, it's no longer your responsibility. You're not responsible for that translator. The client still has to pay you, but it's no longer your translation if it's been mangled by somebody else. And so there's a number of issues here in the translation section, and I certainly think that they're important. People do a lot of translation. Ethical issues do arise, and a number of these points I think can help translators do a better job and get the reward that they deserve.
And the best thing about translation ethical dilemmas is that they don't have 1 second to make a decision and think about the consequences. They might have a little longer than that. Yeah? So please make sure to make use of that time.
I know. Look. You know, and this is very important for interpreters, because very often you have to decide very quickly, and by quickly I mean 2, 3 now. That's the time that you've got to make an ethical decision very often.
Yeah, and think about all the potential outcomes.
And translators, of course, I mean, the one luxury that translators do have in relation to that is time. You do have a chance to read the source text. You do have a chance to think about it, how you respond. And it's a little luxury, if I can call it that translators have, but interpreters, of course, have to be on the ball all the time. Okay, Fatih, I'm in your hands because we're on to the last slide.
Thank you. So let's quickly ask, how should we understand professional solidarity? You know, yes. Let's do a little bit of a recap of professional development, which everyone tonight here knows about, obviously.
Yes. Okay. We've got to. Professional development again is there in every profession. With helicopter pilots, the pass mark for their professional development tasks is 100%. You can't make any mistakes in your professional development if you're a helicopter pilot. Luckily, we don't have such rules in interpreting and translation. But now, for example, NAATI, to get recertification, does demand professional development, and that you do a certain amount of professional development. And that's a feature of every profession. I know some people complained about it. They believe that if they got NAATI, the old NAATI accreditation, that should go on forever. But really, I think most people see that this is very important, that people do learn things or relearn things in certain ways. The profession changes, technology changes, and so on. So professional development is important. And if you have a look around at the range of professional development, there's a whole lot in new areas that mightn't have been talked about 20 or 30 years ago. So it's important. And professional solidarity, look, it's slightly misunderstood. I said before that professionals may be competing with each other, and yes, we're in a competitive market situation as freelancers, and that's understood. But professional solidarity, it means, well, some elementary things, such as being able to help your profession. If you're asked for help by another interpreter or translator, you know, offer it to them if they haven't worked in a particular area before and you have, by all means, do that. It also means, participating in professional life, whether it's a professional association or whatever. But it also the code specifically relates to if there are disputes between practitioners, that you resolve these in a professional way rather than insulting each other or trying to bring the other professional down. But more than that, it's also a commitment to the profession. It's a profession that we've chosen. Every profession has got problems. We know the problems in interpreting and translating. I don't need to go through them here, but it is a profession we've chosen, and it's only by actually presenting a united face to the society and to the other people that we work with, and to care about being a good professional, what in philosophy is called virtue ethics, that we want to be a good translator, we want to be a good interpreter, to keep that in mind, because it affects the way the profession is regarded. And people who transgress the code of ethics and do all sorts of things as interpreters, they set up expectations in the profession, in the other professions. Oh, the last interpreter, was very happy to go around and cheer up all the old ladies in the aged care institution. Well, sorry, it's not part of their role. And if that's the expectation of the next interpreter, well, something has gone wrong. And it's this view about, well, what does a good translator do? What does a good interpreter do? How can we present a united face of the profession to all the other people that we work with, whether it's the powerful or the powerless or whoever? How can we present that view that we are worthy of being professionals? So professional solidarity, I think, has got a lot in it, but again, it requires reflection, it requires professional judgment and understanding what professional judgment is.
Thank you very much, Wildis. I think we need to add one more to who gets affected by our ethical decisions. We said that the non-English speaker will, the English speaker will, the interpreter will, but also any ethical decision that we make directly affects the entire profession of interpreting and translating as well. So we have to think on a wider scale too, just like you mentioned.
Yeah. It's now. I mean, that sounds like a bit of a burden, and it is. I mean, you see, the basis of every code of ethics is that there will be certain things that you don't do, even if you would make, I don't know, make more money by doing them or something, But you restrain. It's a self-restraining sort of code, if you like, because you want to present this professional face. You're not doing things just to make more money or because your interests are there or whatever, or you can cut corners. And this is really important. Now, every lawyer or doctor or so on will have stories about interpreters who really weren't up for the job, and some of them have left a deep impression on those professionals, and that puts the whole profession down. So yes, I think that's really crucial.